They say family secrets always come out. But nobody warned Walter Fisher that his would surface through a school project. When his 14-year-old granddaughter submitted a cheek swab for genealogy class, she wasn't digging for scandal. She just wanted a decent grade. What she found instead was a buried lie that had rewritten his entire life since 1979. A stolen company, a stolen name, a stolen future. And the person who had stolen it all was sitting at every family reunion. Walter Fisher, 72 years old, retired auto mechanic. For 44 years, the world has known him as the quiet failure of the Fisher family, while his older brother Harold built Fisher Manufacturing into a $30 million empire. The official story: Walter sold his share in 1979 and stepped aside. History had been written, and Harold was the hero. But when Lily's results came back, they didn't match the family tree her grandfather had sketched on a napkin. That single mismatch was the thread. And once Lily pulled it, the entire fabric of the Fisher legacy began to come apart, because the truth buried at that family table wasn't just about stolen inheritance, it was about stolen identity. To understand what that school project unearthed, you have to go back to the fall of 1979, when the Fisher brothers were still two young men with grease under their fingernails and a handshake agreement that would change everything. Walter Fisher was 27 years old, a gifted machinist who could walk into a room, listen to an engine for 5 seconds, and tell you exactly which bearing was about to fail. Harold was 31, the older brother, the talker, the one who could convince anyone of anything. Together, they pooled every dollar they had, bought a rusted-out warehouse on the industrial edge of Columbus, Ohio, and founded Fisher Automotive Parts. The deal was simple. Walter would design the components and run the shop floor. Harold would handle sales clients' money. 50-50 ownership. Equal stakes. A brother's word. For 2 years, the business grew. Slowly at first, then faster. Walter invented a proprietary valve that changed fuel injection efficiency, and suddenly every supplier in the Midwest wanted a piece. By the spring of 1979, Fisher Automotive Parts was clearing a profit that would have been unthinkable just 18 months earlier. Walter still drove a 15-year-old pickup truck. Harold had started wearing suits. And then, in June of that year, Walter's wife Brenda got sick. Nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue, unexplained bruising. By August, the diagnosis came back. Aplastic anemia, severe. The doctors gave her 18 months, maybe 2 years with aggressive treatment. The bills were going to be catastrophic. Walter needed cash fast. He walked into his brother's office and said he wanted to sell his half of the company. Harold told him not to worry. He said the business was family, that they'd figure it out together. He promised to buy Walter's share at a fair price, enough to cover the medical bills and then some. He said all the right things. The kinds of things you say when you want someone to believe you have their best interests at heart. A few weeks later, a lawyer showed up at Walter's kitchen table with a stack of papers. Walter was exhausted, terrified, operating on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night. He signed where they told him to sign. He didn't read the fine print, because who reads the fine print when it's family? He walked away with a check for $37,000. Brenda's treatment ate through $22,000 of it. The remaining 15 kept the lights on for about 2 years. She died in 1981. After that, Walter drifted. He never started another business, never challenged the terms of the sale. He took a job at a garage near his old neighborhood, rebuilt transmissions, kept his head down. The official family narrative hardened over the decades. Harold told everyone Walter had fumbled the business, couldn't handle the pressure after Brenda got sick, sold his shares out of desperation, and spent the rest of his life tinkering with other people's cars. Walter became the cautionary tale at Thanksgiving dinners, the brother who couldn't cut it. Meanwhile, Harold expanded the company, renamed it Fisher Manufacturing, moved into industrial components, grew it into a $30 million operation with facilities in 3 states. Harold's sons, Robert and David, grew up inside the corner offices. They learned to speak of their Uncle Walter the way you speak of a childhood friend who never made it. A mixture of pity and quiet embarrassment. That was the story everyone believed. Lily Fisher, Walter's granddaughter, grew up hearing that story too. But Lily was different. She was the kind of 14-year-old who never took an answer at face value. She asked hard questions, and she sat in the silence after, waiting. When her biology teacher assigned a family genealogy project using commercial DNA kits, Lily was thrilled. She loved puzzles. She and her grandpa spent a whole afternoon at his kitchen table, spitting into tubes, sketching out the branches of the Fisher family tree. Walter smiled, told her stories she'd heard a dozen times, and for a moment, it was just a sweet afternoon between a grandfather and his granddaughter. Then, the results came back. Lily logged into the Ancestry portal and started matching names. Everything looked normal until she reached a branch that was supposed to connect her to Harold's side of the family. The DNA markers described a relationship that didn't exist. Not a niece to an uncle, but something more distant, second cousins once removed. The genetic link between her and Harold's sons was far weaker than it should have been. It was as if the two families were only tangentially related. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a sample contamination maybe. She called Harold to ask if he'd taken a DNA test himself, just to compare, and the phone went very quiet. Harold told her that home DNA tests weren't reliable, that she should focus on her schoolwork and not go digging into things that didn't concern her. He sounded calm, but Lily heard the thinness underneath, the precise, deliberate calm of someone who was very much not calm at all. Lily brought the results to her grandfather. Walter sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd signed those papers $37,000 ago, and he stared at his granddaughter's science project like it was a foreign language that he absolutely understood, but had spent 44 years pretending he didn't. His hands shook, not from age, but from something older. He finally whispered, "Harold wasn't my father." Then he stopped. The words hung in the air, and Lily saw that her grandfather was crying for the first time in her entire life. But here's the thing Lily did next that changed everything. She didn't call her parents. She didn't call Harold. She went to the Columbus Public Library and pulled the original 1979 property transfer records. What she found was a document that showed Walter's signature on the sale of his shares, witnessed by a notary whose name she didn't recognize, filed on a date when Walter was 300 miles away visiting Brenda in the hospital. The date stamp, the ambulance record she later obtained, told a contradictory story. And underneath that document, buried in an annex nobody had ever requested, was a letter from Harold to the notary instructing him to finalize the sale quickly because the brother doesn't know what he's signing. That letter wasn't typed on a computer. It was handwritten. The kind of evidence that doesn't vanish when you scrub a hard drive. And now a 14-year-old girl had a photocopy of it. Lily Fisher pedaled home from the library with the photocopy folded into her jacket, pressed against her ribs like evidence nobody else was supposed to see. She was 14, but she understood immediately what she was holding, because 14 is old enough to know that handwritten letters from your uncle to a notary telling him to push through a sale while your grandfather was at his dying wife's bedside isn't the kind of thing that gets framed on the office wall. She walked into Walter's kitchen and laid the paper flat on the table next to the Dina results, the two discoveries side by side, and said the words Walter had been avoiding for 4 decades. "Grandpa, Uncle Harold stole everything from you, and I think he made sure nobody could ever find out." Walter stared at the paper. Not at the words, not yet. He stared at the handwriting. He'd seen it 1,000 times on birthday cards, on company letterhead, on the handwritten note Harold had slipped under his door after Brenda's funeral that said, "I'll take care of the business paperwork, you don't need to worry." That same sloping script was now telling him that the man he called his brother had instructed a notary to finalize a deal Walter had never consciously made. The date on the letter was October 2nd, 1979. The hospital records from the Columbus General Medical Center showed that on October 2nd, Brenda was in her 2nd week of acute treatment. Aplastic anemia had caused a hemorrhage. Walter had been at her bedside from 6 in the morning until nearly midnight. He had signed nothing. He had been 3 hours away from the notary office the entire time. So who signed those papers? That question did something to Walter Fisher. You have to understand, for 44 years, he had accepted his life. He had accepted the story that he was the lesser brother, that the business had outgrown him, that Harold had done what needed doing. He had accepted it because accepting the official story was easier than opening a wound that had no end. But that acceptance had been built on a fragile footing, the belief that the failure was his. The moment that belief cracked, everything underneath it started moving. And Walter, at 72, felt a fire he hadn't felt since he'd rebuilt a seized engine with his bare hands at age 20. He looked at Lily. "You said the Dina didn't match either." She nodded and pulled up the ancestry chart. "The markers show that the connection between us and Harold's sons is about a 10% genetic overlap, where it should be 25 for full first cousins. That's what they call second cousins once removed. That happens when the parents are only half-siblings." Walter's mouth opened. He didn't speak. Lily continued, her voice steady and scientific because that's how she coped, by turning everything into data. "It means either you and Harold don't share the same father, or you don't share both parents. But the funny thing is, our haplotype traces back to a Fisher line. So you share a father with someone in the family, just not Harold's father." Or, she hesitated, "Harold isn't your full brother. And that means everything you were told about your stake in the company, the inheritance, the family legacy, might have been based on a lie from the very beginning." Walter sat down. His legs were gone. Over the next 72 hours, the Fisher family was quietly, and then loudly, detonated. Walter called his sister-in-law, Patricia, Harold's wife. She listened for 4 minutes before saying, "Harold told me you'd do this one day. He said the dementia would make you start imagining things." Then she hung up. Robert and David, Harold's sons, both vice presidents at Fisher Manufacturing, sent a joint email to Walter's personal account. It was 12 words long. "We consider this matter closed. Any further communication will be handled by legal." Now, any reasonable person might have seen that as a wall. Lily saw it as confirmation. She spent the next 2 days building a digital folder on her school laptop. She uploaded the Dina report, the transfer records, the handwritten letter. She cross-referenced the notary's name from the signature. A man named Arthur Renshaw. She found his death notice from 1994. But she also found his son, a retired bookkeeper named Paul Renshaw, living in a suburb of Dayton. Lily sent him a direct message on social media. "Did your father ever mention the Fisher deal?" The reply came back within an hour. "Who told you about that? Call me." When Lily called, Paul Renshaw's voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from decades of carrying something heavy. My father told me one story about the Fishers, he said. He said it was the only thing he ever did that kept him up at night. He was hired by Harold Fisher to witness a signature on a sale document. But the man whose name was on the paper wasn't there. Harold told him the brother was too sick to travel, that he'd signed an affidavit already and just needed the notarization to be official, that it was routine, that he was doing the family a favor. My father sealed his stamp, took his fee, and didn't ask questions. He found out 6 months later that the signature was fake. By then, the company was already registered under Harold's sole name, and my father was too scared to come forward. He said if he ever did, Harold Fisher would destroy him. Lily recorded the call with Paul's permission. A 14-year-old girl was now collecting testimony against a $30 million empire and doing it between homework assignments. She brought everything to Walter, and Walter, for the first time since his wife died, picked up his phone and called his brother. The call lasted 18 minutes. We have the call log. We have Lily's notes from the other side of the door. Walter, voice cracking, asked Harold one question. Was any of it real? Harold replied with what sounded like a practiced speech. You were never a full partner. You were a mechanic. I gave you more than you deserved. The bloodline issue was just a formality I discovered later, but it validated everything. You were never meant to have what I built. He didn't deny the forgery. He didn't explain the Dina. He just dismissed Walter as if he were an employee being terminated. And then he added a threat. If this goes any further, I'll make sure everyone knows about your daughter, about Lacey's mother, about the real reason you were so quick to sell. Walter froze. Lacey's mother was Brenda. She died of aplastic anemia. What could Harold possibly mean? The line went dead. Walter looked at Lily, who had been listening through the door. He had never told his granddaughter about the dark rumor that had circulated in the family for decades, that Brenda's illness wasn't spontaneous, that her workplace in the factory floor might have exposed her to something. Walter had never pursued it because he had no proof, and above all, he was exhausted. But now, Harold had dangled that detail like a leash. The threat wasn't about money. It was about the entire Fisher legacy, and about a secret that might connect the stolen company to the very death of Walter's wife. Because here was the pivot no one saw coming. What if the factory that made Harold rich was the same factory that slowly poisoned Brenda? And what if the cover-up started the day Harold decided he didn't want a partner who might ask too many questions about the safety violations? Lily typed 3 words into her laptop search bar: Fisher Manufacturing OSHA violations 1970s. The screen filled with results. She turned the laptop toward Walter. There, archived in a local newspaper database, was an article from August of 1978. The headline read, Workers' Safety Complaints Filed at Fisher Plant After 3 Employees Hospitalized. The company's response at the time, given by Harold Fisher himself, was that the incidents were unrelated to working conditions. 2 months later, the complaints were withdrawn. Walter had been on the floor in those months. He was the one who first flagged the chemical exposure risks to Harold. And Harold had told him to stay in his lane. The pieces were starting to fit. But then, on the morning of May the 4th, a registered letter arrived at Walter's door from Harrison and Walsh, a corporate law firm representing Fisher Manufacturing. It was a cease and desist, demanding the return of confidential company documents and threatening a civil suit for defamation, tortious interference, and, remarkably, conversion of intellectual property relating to the valve design Walter had invented in 1978. The valve that was still in production and earning the company 8 figures a year. Harold wasn't just trying to shut him up. He was claiming ownership of Walter's own invention. And the legal machinery of a company worth $30 million was now pointed directly at an old man with a cracked driveway and a granddaughter who refused to stop asking questions. That was the moment Walter Fisher decided he wasn't going to be quiet anymore. He called a lawyer. But not just any lawyer. He called his daughter, Lacey, Lily's mother, who hadn't spoken to the family in years because she'd been shut out of the Fisher story herself. And that reunion was about to open a door even Lily didn't know existed. Lacey Fisher hadn't stepped foot in Ohio for 11 years. She had built a career as a forensic accountant in Chicago, a woman who could look at a balance sheet and tell you exactly where someone had buried a lie. She'd been 9 years old when her mother died, 15 when Harold's son started whispering at family gatherings that her father was a failure who'd lost the company. She'd grown up feeling a quiet, untraceable shame about her own last name. A shame she couldn't put her finger on, but had spent her entire adult life trying to outrun. Then her 14-year-old daughter called her and said, "Mom, I think Grandpa was robbed, and I have proof." Lacey drove 6 hours to Columbus that same night and arrived at Walter's front door with a laptop bag and an expression that said she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to finally ask her to fight back. She spent 12 hours at Walter's kitchen table reviewing everything Lily had gathered. The Dina report, the property transfer records, the ambulance log showing Walter's location on the day the sale was supposedly signed, Paul Renshaw's recorded statement, the 1978 OSHA article. When she finished, she looked at her father and said 4 words that rearranged the entire room: "There's a lot more." Lacey had spent her career uncovering corporate fraud, and the second she cross-referenced the Fisher Manufacturing Incorporation documents from 1980 with the bank records Harold later used to claim sole ownership, she found something that made the forgery look like a prologue. Harold hadn't just faked Walter's signature to take the company. He had used Walter's name to secure a small business administration loan in 1981 for $140,000. The loan was guaranteed by the company's assets. The loan documents listed Walter as co-signer and co-owner, which was convenient because Harold needed a second signature to qualify for the amount. Walter's signature appeared on those papers too, a signature Walter had never seen. Lily's eyes went wide. She pulled up the spa loan filing and pointed to the notary stamp. It was the same notary, Arthur Renshaw. The man who told his son he'd been too scared to come forward had notarized not one forged document, but at least 3. The sale, the loan guarantee, and, as Lacey discovered 20 minutes later, a document from 1985 transferring the company's patent for the Fisher fuel injection valve from a joint filing into Harold's sole name. The valve that had generated an estimated $17 million in royalties over the decades. The valve Walter had designed in his garage and brought to the company as his contribution. Harold hadn't just stolen the business, he'd systematically airbrushed Walter out of every legal record that connected him to anything valuable. But here is where the story lifts out of a simple inheritance dispute and lands in something far darker. While Lacey was tracing the financial fraud, Lily kept circling back to the OSHA article. She couldn't let go of the timeline. The complaints in August '78. The hospitalized workers. The sudden withdrawal of the complaints. And then, less than a year later, her grandmother Brenda, who sometimes helped on the floor sorting parts, began developing the symptoms of aplastic anemia. Lily asked her science teacher for help interpreting the chemical safety sheets she found in a trade journal archive. The answer that came back was benzene. In the late 1970s, Fisher Automotive Parts was using a degreasing compound that contained industrial benzene, a known bone marrow toxin. Proper ventilation was required. Protective equipment was mandated. But old photos from the factory floor, later shared by a former employee, showed a workspace with sealed windows and no respirators. The same employee told Lily in a trembling phone call that Harold had personally ordered the ventilation systems removed to cut costs. Now connect those dots in sequence. Walter designs the valve that makes the company's future possible. Walter notices the safety violations and brings them to his brother. His brother dismisses him. Brenda works on that floor and falls gravely ill. Walter needs cash to save her. Harold seizes that need, forges a signature, seizes the company, and removes the one person who could connect the factory conditions to his wife's disease. It wasn't just a theft of money. It was a containment operation. And for 44 years, Walter had been the scapegoat that kept the containment intact. The moment that revelation crystallized, Lacey did something no one expected. She picked up her phone and called Harold directly. Not Walter. Lacey, the niece who had been dismissed as the emotional daughter of the failure. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply said, "Uncle Harold, I have the spa loan documents, the patent transfer, 2 notarized forgeries, and a witness statement from the notary's son. I also have a former employee who will testify about the benzene exposure on the floor in 1978 and your direct order to remove ventilation. The only thing I don't have is a clear answer to one question. Did you know the degreaser you put on that floor was going to kill my mother?" There was a pause. Not a long one, but a revealing one. The kind of pause that happens when a person who has spent decades controlling the narrative suddenly realizes he's not controlling the microphone anymore. Then Harold hung up. 2 hours later, Walter received a second registered letter. This one was not a cease and desist. It was a formal offer to negotiate a private settlement. Harold was offering $200,000 in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement and the surrender of all documents. The offer was dated before Lacey's phone call, but it arrived after, as if Harold had sensed the ground shifting beneath him weeks earlier and was now sprinting to patch the cracks. Walter held the check in his hands. Not a check, an offer letter with a payment schedule. He looked at it, and for a moment, Lacey and Lily watched him hold the quiet tension of a man who had lived his entire life being told he was worth very little, now being asked to name his price. He set the letter down. "They think I want the money," he said. "They think I've been sitting here all these years wanting a check." He turned to Lily. "What did the Dina actually show about Harold and me?" Lily pulled up the raw data. She had been running deeper analysis with a genealogy forum. The markers didn't just show they were half-siblings. They showed a 17% shared genetic match, which, given their ages and the family tree, indicated they likely shared the same father, but not the same mother. Walter's mother, Marianne, had died when he was an infant. His father remarried a woman named Eileen, Harold's mother, and raised them both as full brothers. But the Dina revealed a secret that predated even the company. Walter was the son of the first wife, and Harold, the second, both heirs to the same Fisher name. But only one was the biological son of the woman who inherited the family's seed capital. That seed capital had come from Eileen's father, a local businessman who had gifted the Fishers money on the condition it was used to start a business for his daughter's children. Harold, knowing Walter was not his full brother, had built a legal case over decades that the business belonged solely to Eileen's bloodline. And that meant, in Harold's mind, Walter was entitled to exactly nothing. The theft wasn't just opportunistic. It was premeditated on a foundation of family secrets that stretched back before Walter could walk. And the same brother who smiled at him across holiday tables had spent 30 years weaponizing that bloodline against him. But here is what Harold never saw coming. Because Lily Fisher, that 14-year-old girl who just wanted a good grade on a school project, had gone further than old notary stamps. She had found a marriage certificate from 1951 that showed Eileen's father had never legally formalized the conditional gift. The money was a handshake transfer with no written trust instrument. The condition attached to the seed capital was unenforceable. Harold's entire bloodline argument, the legal shield he'd paid a decade's worth of attorneys to construct, was built on a premise that dissolved the moment anyone actually looked at it. And Lily had looked. Lacey folded her laptop. Walter folded the settlement letter and placed it in a drawer without signing. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, 3 generations of Fishers, armed with the kind of evidence that doesn't just win lawsuits. It rewrites family histories. Walter placed his hand over Lily's. "You gave me back my name," he said. But the real restoration was just beginning. Because the following morning, Lacey filed a civil complaint in Franklin County, and the news hit the local press within hours. The headline read, "Fisher Manufacturing Founder Accused of Forgery, Fraud, and Concealing Toxic Exposure Tied to Sister-in-Law's Death." Harold's empire, for the first time in 44 years, was facing something more powerful than money or lawyers. It was facing the truth. And the truth had a 14-year-old fact-checker who wasn't done yet. The lawsuit landed like a hammer on glass. Within 48 hours of Lacey's filing, 2 major Midwestern distributors announced they were suspending contracts with Fisher Manufacturing pending the outcome of the investigation. The local news ran the benzene allegations on the evening broadcast. A former shift supervisor named Clara Ehrlich, now 79 years old, saw the story and called the tip line to say she had kept a diary from her time on the floor in 1978. She had written down the exact date Harold Fisher walked through the factory and ordered the ventilation fans removed to cut the electric bill. That diary entry, dated June 14, 1978, matched the window of Brenda Fisher's exposure. The district attorney's office opened a preliminary review. Harold responded the way men like Harold always respond when the walls start closing. He tried to buy time. He issued a statement through his attorney calling the allegations the desperate fantasy of a disgruntled former employee harboring decades of resentment. He characterized Walter as an unstable old man being manipulated by his daughter and granddaughter. But that strategy collapsed within days when Paul Renshaw, the notary's son, gave a sworn deposition. He produced his father's personal notebook, a leather-bound journal Arthur Renshaw had kept locked in a safety deposit box. Inside were detailed entries about 3 separate forgeries he'd notarized for Harold Fisher: the 1979 stock sale, the 1981 spa loan, and the 1985 patent assignment. The notebook included the dates, the amounts, and a chilling note in the margin of the final entry. "He told me the brother didn't need to know. He said it was for the family's future. I believed him. I should have believed the signature." Once that deposition hit the public record, Harold's sons Robert and David called an emergency board meeting. They were not stupid men. They understood that their inheritance was tethered to a document trail that was now dissolving in real time. They faced a choice: continue defending a father who had built their fortune on fraud, or distance themselves and try to salvage something. They chose survival. Robert, the older son and company's CFO, contacted Lacey directly and proposed a settlement negotiation. Not through lawyers in a formal mediation chamber, but at the same restaurant in downtown Columbus where Harold had once celebrated his 40th anniversary with the company. It was a symbolic location. Everyone in that room understood that. Walter arrived wearing the same flannel jacket he'd worn to every family dinner Harold had ever hosted. Lily sat to his left, Lacey to his right. On the other side of the table sat Robert and David Fisher, their legal counsel, and a corporate mediator. Harold was not present. He had been advised by his own attorneys to stay home, but the absence was its own admission. Robert opened the conversation. His voice was measured, careful, the voice of a man who had rehearsed every syllable. "Uncle Walter, we understand now that certain documents from the past were improperly handled. Our family has carried this misunderstanding for too long, and we believe it's time to correct the record." He paused, as if waiting for applause. Walter didn't speak. He just looked at his nephew the way you look at a used car salesman who has just called a salvage title a unique opportunity. Lily pushed a document across the table. It was a forensic DNA analysis, notarized and verified by an independent lab, that showed Walter's biological relationship to Harold as half-sibling through the paternal line only. It also showed that the Fisher manufacturing seed capital originated from Eileen's father, but that the funds were an unsecured personal gift with no written trust, no legal conditions, and no binding exclusion of Walter as a beneficiary. Furthermore, the gift had been made 6 months after Walter was born, when Eileen's father was fully aware of Walter's existence and raised no objection to his inclusion as family. The mediator read the document. Robert's attorney leaned in. There was a long silence while they recalibrated. "That might complicate our initial position," Robert said quietly. "It does more than complicate it," Lacey said. "It erases your father's entire legal rationale for excluding my father from every single asset he helped build. The forgery wasn't covering a mistake. It was manufacturing a theft on a pretext that never existed." The settlement that followed took 3 weeks of intense negotiation, but the core terms were inescapable. Walter would be reinstated as co-founder of the company. His stake was valued by an independent auditor at 47% of Fisher Manufacturing's total equity, based on his original contributions and the subsequent value generated by his patented valve. Harold was removed from all operational control. The company would pay Walter a lump sum restitution of $6.8 million, representing the dividends he would have received over 44 years had his ownership not been illegally erased. Additionally, all future royalties from the Fisher fuel injection valve would revert to Walter's estate. The valve patent alone was estimated to generate another $4 to $5 million in the next decade. Robert and David would retain minority stakes, but the Fisher name on the building would now belong to the brother who had actually designed what it sold. But the money, for all its magnitude, was not the resolution Walter had been seeking. He had spent 44 years being told he was a failure. The check wouldn't heal that. What healed it came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the settlement, when the Columbus Historical Society contacted Walter to inform him that the original Fisher valve prototype, which he had built in his garage, had been identified in a storage locker Harold kept, and they wanted to display it in the local Inventors Hall of Fame. They asked Walter to attend the installation. He did. He stood next to a glass case containing a piece of metal he had machined with his own hands while his wife was still alive, while the world was still full of possibility. He touched the glass, and Lily took a photograph. That photo, she later said, was the first time she had ever seen her grandfather smile with his whole face. Then came the surprise nobody expected. While the civil suit was in full motion, the EPA opened a site investigation at the old Fisher plant based on Clara Ehrlich's testimony and the benzene records. The investigation uncovered buried barrels of degreasing solvent in a lot behind the warehouse, improperly sealed, leaching into the groundwater. Harold had known about the disposal and had signed off on a cut-rate waste removal contract that simply buried the evidence. The criminal investigation that followed resulted in charges of environmental negligence and reckless endangerment. Harold was allowed to plead to a lesser count in exchange for a suspended sentence and permanent barring from any corporate directorship. But the deal required a public admission of the cover-up. On the steps of the courthouse, Harold Fisher, now 76 years old, read a statement acknowledging that he had ordered ventilation removed despite safety warnings, and that his actions had likely contributed to unsafe working conditions. He did not mention Brenda's name. He did not have to. Walter stood in the audience with Lacey and Lily. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He just watched his brother, the man who had stolen his company, his invention, and his reputation, stand before the cameras and admit what Walter had known in his bones since 1979. When it was over, Harold was led away by his attorney. He didn't look at Walter. He didn't look at anyone. That evening, the Fisher family gathered not at some corporate restaurant, but at Walter's house, the same modest house with the cracked driveway. Lily made hot chocolate. Lacey ordered pizza. They sat in the living room surrounded by cardboard boxes of evidence that had now served their purpose. The television was off. Nobody was checking the news. Walter held a small, framed photograph of Brenda that had sat on his dresser for 40 years. He set it on the coffee table. "She knew," he said quietly. "Before she died, she told me to forgive Harold. She said carrying anger was heavier than carrying a company. I didn't understand then. I just thought she was being kind." He paused. "I think she knew the whole time that Harold had set us up, and she still said to forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because I didn't deserve to spend my life as his prisoner." Lily leaned her head on her grandfather's shoulder. "She sounds like she was the smartest Fisher," Lily said. Walter smiled. She was. The final piece of the story arrived a month later when a sealed envelope was delivered to Walter's door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten letter from Harold, written from his home. No legal letterhead, no attorney's stamp, just his sloping script. It read, "I told myself you were never a real Fisher. I told myself so many lies that I forgot they weren't true. By the time I saw what I'd done, I was too deep to climb out. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But Brenda was a good woman. She didn't deserve what that floor did to her. That part wasn't supposed to happen. I'm sorry." Walter read the letter twice. Then he folded it, walked to the kitchen, and lit the corner with the stove burner. He dropped it in the sink and watched the paper curl into ash. He didn't need Harold's apology. He had already reclaimed everything that mattered: his name, his work, his place in his family's history, and a granddaughter who had proven that courage doesn't shout. It does a science project and follows the data where it leads. As for Lily, she received an A on her genealogy project. Her teacher asked if she wanted to present to the class. She stood in front of her classmates, held up the DINA chart, and said, "Family trees aren't just names on a branch. They're stories that either get told or get buried. My grandfather's story was buried for 44 years. We found it in a cheek swab, so maybe when you do your projects, don't just fill in the blanks. Ask why some blanks were left blank." She got a standing ovation. And her grandfather, sitting in the back row with a flannel jacket and the first genuine public pride he had felt in decades, clapped louder than anyone. In that gymnasium, surrounded by poster boards and science fair ribbons, the weight of 44 years finally lifted. What Walter Fisher felt wasn't victory over Harold. It was something quieter. The end of a story he'd been telling himself since the day they buried his wife. The story that said he wasn't enough, that he'd failed, that his name was a footnote in someone else's legacy. Lily's science project didn't just correct a family tree. It returned a man to himself. We tell ourselves that the past is buried, that what's done is done, that it's easier not to dig. But buried things have a way of surfacing, not always in a courtroom or on the evening news. Sometimes they surface in a library on a Tuesday afternoon, or in a recorded phone call with a notary's elderly son. And when they do, they don't just change bank accounts or legal documents. They change the stories people carry inside their own chests. Walter spent his entire adult life believing he was the brother who couldn't cut it. He lived to see the day the Historical Society put his name next to his invention, and he stood in a glass-walled hall that proved, beyond any signature Harold could forge, who had built what. The real scandal here isn't just the forgery or the benzene barrels or the stolen millions. It's the fragility of truth. How one man's signature could be faked, and a whole family could be taught to look away. How an entire legacy could be rewritten because the person who knew the truth was too exhausted, too broke, too gaslit to fight back. That's the warning. And it's also the hope. Because it only took one generation, a granddaughter who hadn't learned to stay quiet, to flip the entire story right side up. Lily didn't need a law degree. She needed a question nobody else would ask, and the stubbornness to keep pulling the thread. The rise of consumer DNA testing has opened a door that can't be closed. How many other dinner tables have a Walter Fisher sitting at the head, carrying a quiet that isn't peace, but exhaustion? How many family businesses, inheritances, and identities are built on signatures that don't belong to the people whose names they bear? Lily's project is a blueprint, not for litigation, but for truth-telling. She didn't seek revenge. She sought accuracy. And that accuracy reclaimed a man's entire history. And Walter? He still drives his old pickup. He still wears flannel. He didn't become a different man after the settlement. He became the man he always was, just finally seen. The money, the patent royalties, the name on the building, those are evidence of what was restored. But the real restoration happened at that science fair, when a 14-year-old said, "My grandfather's story was buried, and we found it." That's not just a school project. That's an inheritance no one can forge. Harold Fisher lives with the knowledge that the truth didn't die with Brenda. It grew up, got a laptop, and came for him with a Dina kit and a library card. And the rest of the family, the ones who spent decades believing the official version, they're left to rebuild their own understanding. Some will, some won't. That's the messy afterword of a story like this. If Lily Fisher's determination reminded you that the quietest people often carry the heaviest truths, maybe it's time to ask that question at your own table. The one that starts with, "I was always told this, but I'm not sure anymore." You might find nothing. Or you might find everything. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that subscribe button and leaving a comment. Tell us which moment hit you the hardest, because we read them. And if you've ever uncovered a family secret that rewrote your own history, we want to hear about it. We'll be here with another real, raw story soon. Thank you for being a part of this sphere. We'll see you in the next one.